When we hear the phrase, a woman with no friends, it tends to trigger a quiet discomfort. We instinctively search for what's wrong, what's missing, what must have gone broken in her story. But that reaction says more about our conditioning than it does about her reality. Because solitude, when chosen consciously, is not a deficit, it's a turning point. There is a profound psychological shift that happens when a woman begins to step away from constant social noise. At first, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels unfamiliar, even unsettling. We are wired for connection, after all. But what often goes unnoticed is how much of that connection is built on performance rather than truth. We learn early on how to fit in, how to be agreeable, how to maintain harmony, even at the cost of our authenticity. And over time, that cost accumulates. So when a woman begins to withdraw, it is rarely impulsive. It is the result of awareness. She starts to recognize the subtle ways she has been abandoning herself in order to belong. The conversations where she edits her thoughts. The friendships where she feels unseen. The spaces where her presence is tolerated but not truly valued. And instead of continuing that quiet erosion of self, she makes a different choice. She chooses distance. Not as an act of rejection toward others, but as an act of responsibility toward herself. This is where solitude begins to transform. Because in that space, without the constant feedback of others, she is finally confronted with something both challenging and liberating, herself unfiltered. No roles to play, no expectations to meet, no need to perform. Just her thoughts, her patterns, her truths. This is the work that Brené Brown often points to when she speaks about vulnerability, not as weakness, but as courage. Because it takes courage to sit with yourself without distraction. It takes courage to face the parts of you that have been shaped by fear, by approval, by the need to be liked. And in that quiet, something begins to realign. She starts to hear her own voice more clearly, not the voice shaped by others, but the one that has been there all along. She begins to question what she truly believes, what she truly wants, and what she is no longer willing to tolerate. And slowly, her identity shifts from something externally constructed to something internally grounded. This is not loneliness. This is self-reclamation. Of course, the outside world may not understand this. People may interpret her distance as arrogance, as coldness, as disconnection. But what they fail to see is that she is not disconnecting from life. She is reconnecting with it in a more honest way. She is no longer interested in shallow exchanges that leave her feeling empty. She is no longer willing to dilute herself for the sake of comfort. And yes, this path can feel isolating at times. Growth often does. But there is a difference between being alone and being misaligned. And she has simply chosen the former over the latter. Because once a woman experiences the clarity that comes from truly knowing herself, she cannot unsee it. She cannot return to spaces that require her to shrink, to pretend, to fragment who she is. Solitude, in this sense, becomes not a permanent state, but a necessary passage, a recalibration of identity. And from that place, any future connection she chooses will no longer be rooted in need, but in alignment. So if you find yourself in a season of solitude, resist the urge to label it as something negative. Instead, ask yourself a different question. What is this space trying to teach me about who I am when no one else is defining me? Because the truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. The most important relationship you will ever build is the one you have with yourself, and sometimes it takes standing alone to finally build it right. There's a common misconception that when a woman has no close circle around her, she must have built walls so high that no one can reach her. But that interpretation often misses something far more nuanced and far more honest. It's not that she has become closed off, it's that she has become discerning. At some point, usually after a series of quiet disappointments, she begins to recognize a pattern. Not necessarily in others, but in what she has been willing to accept. The friendships where she overextends herself just to keep the peace. The dynamics where her loyalty is constant, but the reciprocity is conditional. The moments where she laughs along, even when something feels off, just to avoid being seen as difficult. And eventually something within her shifts. She starts to understand that connection, in its truest form, cannot be sustained through self-neglect. That belonging should not require her to betray her own boundaries. And that being liked is not the same as being respected. This is where her standards begin to rise. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, but quietly, internally. She becomes more aware of how people make her feel, not just in their presence, but in their absence. She pays attention to consistency, to effort, to emotional safety. And perhaps most importantly, she stops negotiating on the things that once felt negotiable. This is not about becoming rigid. It's about becoming clear. And clarity changes everything. Because once she is clear on her worth, her time, and her energy, she no longer feels the same urgency to fill her life with people just to avoid being alone. The fear of solitude that once drove her decisions begins to lose its power. In its place, a different kind of standard emerges, one that prioritizes depth over proximity, truth over comfort. This is the kind of shift that Brené Brown often describes when she talks about boundaries. Not as a way to shut people out, but as a way to define what is acceptable with. Because boundaries are not walls, they are guidelines. They are a reflection of self-respect made visible. And when a woman truly understands this, she stops explaining her boundaries to those who consistently challenge them. She stops over-justifying her need for space, for honesty, for mutual effort. Instead, she allows her choices to speak. She distances herself from what feels misaligned, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Of course, this can be misunderstood. People who benefited from her lack of boundaries may perceive her change as rejection. They may call her distant, guarded, or even selfish. But what they are really encountering is a version of her that no longer prioritizes their comfort over her own well-being. And that can be uncomfortable for them. But for her, it is liberating. Because for the first time, her relationships are no longer built on obligation or fear, but on intention. She is no longer asking, "Who will stay if I give more?" Instead, she is asking, "Who shows up without me having to lose myself?" And that question filters everything. It means she may have fewer people around her. It means her circle may look smaller, quieter, even empty at times. But what it also means is that any connection she allows into her life will meet her where she stands, not where she used to shrink herself to be. This is not isolation. This is refinement. It is the process of removing what is inconsistent, what is draining, what is performative, until only what is real has the opportunity to remain. And yes, it requires patience. It requires a willingness to sit in the in-between, the space where old connections have fallen away, but new ones have not yet fully formed. But she understands now that rushing this process would only recreate what she has already outgrown. So she waits, not passively, but intentionally. She invests in herself, in her growth, in her peace. She becomes someone who no longer seeks validation through proximity,